Thanks very much for the invitation to be here, and I hope I will give you all something to think about. I certainly get a lot to think about whenever I visit here, because as I told Ken earlier, it's great to be around smart people thinking about big ideas. That's really my favorite thing to do. And if you notice from my introduction, my research area is actually in genomics, evolutionary genomics for the human genome specifically, and what makes us different. And you'll also notice most of my writing is all about how we're not different. And as my mother said, you found a way to even argue with yourself. But that's by design, because I think it's two sides of the same coin. To understand why we are the way we are, who we are, what we're like, you really have to consider our continuity with other living things, which we're going to hear more about, and I can't wait for that talk by Erica. But also what does make us different. All species are different. All species are unique. All species are exceptional. Humans and pursuing human exceptionalism is something I do genetically. So I'm not one of these scientists who poo-poo the idea of human exceptionalism. However, one thing I will say is we have to be very careful on what we claim we can do that other animals can't do, because the last 25 years has been a lesson of all of basically redefining what makes humans unique, because we keep finding things in other animals that they do. And one thing I will not do today is try to summarize the whole field of animal cognition. I actually set out to do that when I was writing this talk, and I realized it was, first of all, pointless, but second of all, impossible. And I can give you a reading list if you want to do that. Instead, I thought I might bring you up to speed on the thinking about animal cognition, how much it's changed recently by the scientists themselves that do that. And the second thing I would do is give you sort of my thoughts on what I think would be fruitful areas to think about what makes us so different and how we got that way. So I have a couple of quotes of my own, Fuzz. And one thing I want to mention, and the last quote he had from me, I want to clarify an important point, which was the first two words of that quote, which was, I think. Right, so none of us knows, the full story here, and in fact, I don't think anyone alive today will be around for the full story. The story's never completed, right? And that's what's so great about science. No one gets the last word. It's a self-correcting process that never really gets to full correction, right? And that's the fun of it, is we're all going to contribute a little bit. We all, hopefully, we're zeroing in on the truth. But it's kind of an infinite regress as we get there. I do think we know a lot more than we did 20 years ago. And I can't wait to find out what we learn in the next 20 years. But here's a quote. You've already heard this one. It's a quote that anyone interested in animal intelligence will be very familiar with it and the thinking. But I'm going to introduce it to you in a new way, because this kind of thinking from Charles Darwin about the continuity that humans had in our mind, and I'm going to come back to the mind a lot, was actually very typical of that era of Victorian scientists. We tend to think that prior generations thought animals were stupid and humans were smart. And that's true for the last generation. But if you go further back than that, there was a much more appreciation for animal intelligence and cognition and what they were capable of. And in fact, Carl Linnaeus, who no one was more committed as a scientist to humans being at the top of creation, even he depicted chimpanzees with tools in their hands when he wrote, I don't know how to say it, but Systema Naturalis. So the thinking prior to the 20th century was actually much more expansive in terms of animal abilities. And so what we're really seeing right now is a field in resurgence. I chose that word on purpose, not surgence, but resurgence. We're reclaiming some of the knowledge creation that went dormant. So from ancient times through the early modern period, the thinking about an inner life of animals, animal emotions, and all this was much closer to what we're approaching now in terms of respecting animals as agents with will, that make decisions, that have feelings and emotions, and those are different, and I'll talk about how they're different. And what happened, unfortunately, afterwards was a real austere way of thinking about animals that was born out of the field of behaviorism. So you will probably associate behaviorism with B.F. Skinner and Ivan Pavlov and John Watson. And their thinking was that animals were simply stimulus response machines and they could do learning by operant conditioning, and that was it. There was really nothing more to them than that. They were sophisticated stimulus response machines. And of course, the idea was to dissect human behavior with that same austerity, really sort of denying almost any inner life, not just to animals, but possibly even to humans. And I want you to know that really set the field back a good 50 years, because that was the thinking about animal behavior. And where would we be if we hadn't lost those 50 years? It was really kind of the dark ages of animal biology. And the important thing to remember is all of the thinking and all of the data, all of the knowledge creation during that period was done by putting animals, solitary animals, raised far from their natural environments, into boxes and cages and poked and prodded in ways that are nowhere close to how they actually live. So it's not surprising that that they would get a much reduced expression or ideas about their inner existence. How did that change? How did that begin to change? Well, first of all, beginning here in the 1960s, you really have what we call the cognitive revolution, where neuroscience and psychology started to come together. What I mean by that is the idea of how we are as people, how we make our decisions, started to really be appreciated, that our mind is seated in our brain. So the activities of the brain and how it works is what the mind springs forth. Or one way to say it is the mind is what the brain does. This idea that we can actually dissect this. And some of the earliest work was actually because of pharmacology, when mood-altering substances, psychoactive substances, started to be discovered, and we realized we could treat things like schizophrenia, and people had a totally different inner experience. So the idea is, wow, brain chemistry really does lead to our understanding and experience of the world. And no one, I hope, would reduce it to that, but it's certainly a key component in that. So, and what happened in the cognitive revolution was mirrored by the modern evolutionary synthesis. So these two processes were happening around the same time, from the 1940s to the 1960s. So those of you who don't know, the modern evolutionary synthesis was the coming together of the field of biology, because in the decades leading up to this, the geneticists, the field biologists, often called naturalists, and the chemists, which became biochemists eventually, were all doing very different things in different realms, not talking to each other. And the field was really forking, or whatever the verb would be for three branches, going in different directions, really diverging to the point of almost irreconcilable thinking about biology. However, from the 1940s to the 1960s, those fields finally started to come back together because of the emergence of population genetics. So you had population genetics merged the growing field of molecular biology with our understanding of classical genetics, and brought things back into congruence around the idea of evolution. So evolution by natural selection and other means was the unifying idea that brought all of those fields of biology together, and where they remain today, which is great. Well, that same process happened in cognitive psychology, where the study of behavior, the study of biology, and of course, animal behavior was mostly studied in the lab. So field biologists and psychologists in the lab were not speaking the same language at all. But when these ideas finally started to come together, the field of animal cognition began to stand on its feet finally, and started to make some real progress. We're still doing that. That process is still going on. But the main, I think, victory was the reemergence of the idea that animals have minds. They do have a mind. I'm not saying it's like a human mind. There's much to talk about and how they're different, but the animals do have something akin to a mind. Of course, humans really need to think of ourselves as exceptional and different for a variety of reasons. And without critiquing that, let me just say, the consequence of that has been constantly redefining the terms, constantly moving the goalposts, because we all want to hear what humans can do that other animals can't. So every time this happens, and we discover a new ability in animals, we just have to redefine it, even to the point where we've redefined what a tool is multiple times. You may not know this, but well, maybe you do know this, but one of the features of humanity, early definitions of humanity, was that we're the only species that makes tools and uses tools. How anyone could have actually thought that is really remarkable, because almost every species really uses a tool of some kind. And in fact, I'll talk more about that in just one second. So what's left? If we take all of these abilities that we think of as human unique and we find them in other animals, correlates in other animals, what's left? Well, the only thing left is everything. And that's the integration of these abilities. And that's where I'm going to leave you at the end of the talk. Hopefully I'll convince you that there's something to chew on there. So we first just got to, this one slide was what I was going to talk about the whole talk, but I've just reduced it to one slide. So I'm going to move through this quickly. Those of you who want to know more about individual topics, I can recommend papers and things. But so tool use, this is most definitely not human unique in any way. The ability to take an item, move that item to a new location and use it for a different purpose than it was originally existing as is not at all unique to humans. You can find this. I have an example of a primate, a cetacean, and a bird using a tool. These are not hard to find. And in fact, actually, you'll see this macaque here using what's called a meta tool, where two different tools are brought together, neither one of which can do the job that he wants, and he needs both of them in order to accomplish this task. This is spontaneous behavior. I shouldn't say spontaneous behavior. It's learned, but it's socially learned. It's not taught by humans or anything like that. If you teach them, of course, they can do all kinds of things with tools, and that's not irrelevant, but we'll talk more about that in a second as well. So tool use, definitely not human unique. Self-awareness. So this is a classic example of, well, for a long time, it was thought that humans were the only self-aware creature, that really aware of ourselves as a unique member of the group. And partially this was done through what's called the mirror test, where you put a mirror in front of an animal, make a mark that they can't see themselves, but they can see in the mirror, and will they try to remove that mark or touch that mark? That's called the mirror test for self-awareness. You've probably heard of that. The problem with this test is that it does not at all capture how most animals identify themselves and each other. That's how we do it. Mirrors don't exist in the wild. Animals have no experience with mirrors and no way to comprehend what a reflection is. It's just not part of their natural ecology. However, once we start to design these tests that are congruent with how animals recognize each other, they start to pass this test. And of course, the list of species that pass this test is endless. Almost every species where you'd look for this. And what I mean by how they recognize themselves, let me just give you the simple example. Your dog does not recognize you by how you look, right? And that's why pictures and videos and things, a dog will never recognize its owner from a picture or a video the way we would. They recognize you by your smell, your unique, pheromones and other molecules that emit from you, whether you're clean or dirty. They will recognize you, and they'll recognize you far away. It's kind of remarkable. It's almost imperceptible or unimaginable how sensitive and discriminatory their sense of smell is. Millions of times more sensitive than ours, and that's how so once you design a test for self-awareness using smell, the dogs pass it every time. They can recognize themselves by that smell and others in distinct ways that way. And in fact, this has gotten so out of hand that there were papers talking about the self-awareness of zebrafish. So zebrafish have very small number of neurons. The idea that they're self-aware that in the way that we are self-aware is silly. Even to fish biologists would say that. And so we have to now, again, redefine the tool a little bit and say, well, that's just self-recognition. Self-awareness is something different. So the field is dealing with those two terms and trying to separate them. But it's early. These are early days in this research because of all the time that we've lost. So let's not get too out over our skis on some of these concepts. Certainly emotions are not human unique at all. Now, the problem, though, is a lot of times when we talk about emotions, people think about feelings, right? Feelings are very different than emotions. Emotions can be defined and understood in relatively dry clinical terms. They're behavioral programs, basically, that run in the brain and that drive behavior. Okay, so something simple like hunger is an emotion, right? You feel something and it drives you to act in a certain way. We can study those in other animals. Things like grief, there is an inner experience of grief, right? And that it's very hard to describe in other animals, but I can't describe your inner feeling of grief either. I recognize that you have it, and I'm pretty certain you have it, but that's that sort of the problem of other minds. You can't really know what it's like to have that inner subjective experience of someone else or another creature. But the emotion of grief in the clinical definition of it is certainly present in other animals. I devote a whole chapter of that in my book to grief. And just to show you just one simple example, here's an elephant, baby elephant who's been rejected by his mother and who is sobbing inconsolably. And he will do that, and he did do that for a period of weeks, and slowly through the care of other elephants got his life back together, began to stand up again, began to eat again, and something like that, but not before a period of grief, right? So there's just simply no way you could describe grief that wouldn't include most of the social animals in it. Interesting thing, it's a perfect example of what the function of grief is, because all of the other elephants came to aid this baby elephant and fill in the role that of the rejected mother, that the mother rejected for herself. Also empathy. So empathy is something that's sometimes thought as human unique by some, but now we understand, regardless of the two facets of empathy, that other animals have this. So the empathy has two components to it. One is just simply perspective taking, the idea that I understand you have a different perspective than I do, and I can try to put myself in your shoes. And this is in the literal sense, where I know you can see what's behind me and I can't. That gets into theory of mind a little bit, but it's that recognition of perspective taking, that I can see, I know what it's like to be in your position. And of course, this also joins with emotion in the form of emotional contagion. So that form of empathy is the idea that we can identify with someone's emotions so closely that we begin to experience them ourselves on a smaller scale. So if you come to work one day and a coworker's parent has passed away, you've never met that parent, you're not grieving that loss, but you'll feel that grief a little bit, at least in terms of the conversation that you have. You may even cry with that person, right? So emotions are contagious, and that's a component of empathy. And we know that this is true in animals as well. And the reason we know this is true in animals is most of these things have been studied in animals before they were ever studied in humans, especially perspective taking. So we come to the issue of language, and this is going to be a big one, because the way that we use language, everyone knows, is much more dramatic and much more extensive and much more open-ended and generative than the way that animals use language. However, one thing we want to be careful of is we are only really now beginning to understand how animals communicate. So I would urge us all to be very cautious, once again, about getting too far over our skis and saying what animals can't do with their language, because we've been watching chimpanzees for 150 years, and only in the last 10 have we figured out that they have a language of 250 gestures, of sign language, essentially. And these are shared, although with variation, in different groups of chimpanzees. Okay, and there's some of them are even shared with gorillas, which are then, separated from chimpanzees by about 10 million years of separate evolution. So it seems to be hardwired, unlike our language, but there's enough overlap to be what we call statistically significant. This is not just stray gestures and things like that. There's some commonality there. And also, much has been written about the language that we can teach chimpanzees and gorillas. And I wouldn't, the criticism of this is that, well, this is a very artificial way to treat a chimpanzee. It's a heavy learning, and it's operant conditioning, basically. And that some of that's true. That's a critique. I wouldn't say that this chimpanzee is going to then go out and live a life full of poetry and performance art or anything like that. However, the ability to communicate with these gestures was clearly there to be acted on. So it does tell us something about what these chimpanzees are capable of. Is it symbolic thought? Probably not. But what it is representational, it's referential. It's the idea that a gesture here has a concept associated with it. And these apes have combined gestures to form new words. And that's another thing that we have to contend with. Because that does appear generative. For example, Coco the gorilla was famous for doing that. The word for ring, he called it a finger, called it a finger bracelet, right? So that's understanding two concepts and putting them together in a new way. Coco also did a lot of stuttering, so to speak. And so maybe they just spit out accidents every now and then. There's valid criticism on all sides. But one thing that is true about both the bonobos and the chimpanzees that have been taught sign language is they tend to teach it to their children and other affiliates. So you have sort of the beginnings of something like a language that would perpetuate. And this also gets us to the concept of theory of mind, which I want to critique this in both directions. We tend to theorize a lot about what goes on in the minds of animals and other humans, and the idea of how aware are they of somebody else's mental state and what they know and don't know, what they think and feel. But I think that it's been over-theorized in a sense, because it's been separated quite a bit from the bodily understanding. And that might be the human uniqueness, is that we do disembodied theory of mind, right? I can think about what you're going through, or you even as a person, without really thinking about your body in a great detail. Whereas it does seem to be very bodily relevant with the other animals that show aspects of theory of mind. And I'm going to read from this book, which I really recommend if you want to understand how much the field has come up with lately. It's called "Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?" And that's by Frans de Waal, member of the National Academy, probably the smartest primatologist alive today. Yeah, it's called "Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?" by Frans de Waal. Okay. He's written many books. Chimpanzee Politics was the pop science book that really put him on the map, but he's done a lot. Mama's Last Hug was, and anyway, there's any book by him is going to change your mind, or is going to change the way you think about chimpanzees. But this one in particular covers lots of different kinds of animals. I might not get time to read from it, but okay. And then also this idea of morality. And I'm going to expand on this one just as an exemplar of what I think human exceptionalism, where there might be fruitful ground for research there. So I'll come back to that one. But I do want to mention theory of mind for just a moment and talk about what I mentioned before about how disembodied our thinking is on theory of mind. And I want to read from this book because I was trying to just summarize it, but I realized I can just read it. And I want you to notice the date here, in the late 1960s. So that's how far back some of this goes, but it was largely ignored. A scientist called Menzel, who this chapter talks a lot about, would take a young ape by the hand out into a large grassy enclosure in Louisiana to show her hidden food or a scary object, such as a toy snake. So you have food or something scary, but it's hidden from view until it's been shown to this ape. After this, he would bring her back to the waiting group of chimpanzees and release them all together. Would the others pick up on the knowledge that one of them had? And if so, how would they react? Could they tell the difference between the other having seen food or something scary? They most certainly could, being eager to follow a chimp who knew the food location, or being reluctant to stay with one who had just seen a snake. So they copied the other's enthusiasm or alarm, and they had an inkling of his knowledge based on his reading of his body, his behavior. Okay, so that's fine. But scenes around food were especially telling if the knower ranked higher or ranked lower than the guesser. The former had every reason to conceal his or her information to keep the food out of the wrong hands. We, this is Frans de Waal speaking, recently repeated these experiments with our own chimps and found the same subterfuge as reported by Menzel. Katie Hall would remove 2 of our chimps from their outdoor enclosure and keep them temporarily in a building. Low-ranking Raynette would have a small window from which she could look into the enclosure, whereas high-ranking Georgia would have no such view. Katie would walk around hiding 2 food items, 1 entire banana and 1 entire cucumber, and you can guess which one the chimpanzees prefer. She'd stuff food under a rubber tire or in a hole in the ground, in the deep grass, behind a pole, some other place, while Raynette followed her move from inside the enclosure. Then we released both chimps at the same time. By then, Georgia had learned that we'd hidden food, but she'd have no clue about the location. She had learned to carefully watch Raynette, who would walk around as nonchalantly as possible while gradually bringing Georgia closer to the concealed cucumber. With Raynette sitting nearby, Georgia would eagerly dig up the veggie. While she was busy, Raynette would hurry and get the banana. So I tell that story because the longer you think about it, the more you realize that what these animals are capable of, right? First of all, understanding that there's knowledge that they don't have that another chimpanzee has and that they want that knowledge, and they're going to take actions in order to try to get it. And then the other one is going to circumvent those efforts and try to throw them off. So there's deception, there's calculation, there's pantomime, there's a lot going on. How much contemplative inner deliberation goes on, we'll never know. But there's just a whole lot that I think falls very squarely in the bucket of theory of mind. Some idea of some mental gymnastics that goes on in understanding what another animal knows or doesn't know. Another thing I want to mention that connects emotions and theory of mind is I want to show you this scene. So this is a chimpanzee who's passed away named Dorothy. So these are chimpanzees in Africa that have been rescued from circuses and other performances. So they're not equipped to live in the wild because they weren't raised properly. And just like us, you need to learn how to behave. That's another thing you want to think a lot about is chimpanzees learn. They behave the way they do because of their social environment. So when they're raised outside of that, that you can't just release them into the rainforest. So here's a group of chimpanzees. Now, I don't know how many of you have worked with chimpanzees. I assume Erica will probably be struck by this photo as well, because this is a very unusual scene. They do not huddle around peacefully. Chimpanzees are actually pretty aggressive to one another, and they're loud, they're obnoxious. They're actually not the kindest animals in the world, but here they are, quiet, still, looking at the deceased member of their group who was the alpha female, the highest ranking female in the group. And you'll notice the exasperated expressions. Their facial expressions are very similar to ours. You can read chimpanzee emotions fairly well from their facial expressions. And you'll notice the calm that has come over the group. Now, do they understand death and dying? I don't know. Certainly, they know that they've lost a member of their group. This is not the same Dorothy that was there, but they'll recognize her as Dorothy because of the smell and other things, the other cues. And this moment brought the group together. Why is that important in chimpanzees? Well, chimpanzees have a very strict dominance hierarchy. I alluded to that before. Rank is everything in chimpanzee life. And this was the highest ranking female. So what happens when a high-ranking member of the group dies or is lost is social chaos. And there's a period of jockeying for position, reestablishing relationships. They can obviously turn violent. It's not a peaceful time. However, by spending some time with the body, and what happened was they were wheeling her out in the wheelbarrow, and they were going crazy, and they didn't know what to do. So these two workers just sort of brought the body back, and a calm came over them. So what's going on there is that sort of social grief that allows a calming down of tensions so that we don't kill each other, and we contemplate what's going on. And cortisol, of course, spikes during grief, so they're all in an agitated state. And what will happen is a gradual calming and a recalibration of social dynamics. By allowing this grief period to happen, it affects their behavior and the way that they go forward. And I tell this story, first of all, zoos now do this. Zoos perform funerals, essentially, for fallen members of a group because it allows a more peaceful transition to whatever the new social dynamics will be. But again, the longer you think about it, the more you realize what they're capable of understanding, at least on an instinctual level. They understand loss, they understand attachment, they feel grief, and they feel grief collectively with each other. And they have some concept of death, whatever that means for them, and the loss associated with death. So we have to contend with that as well. And I think that also somewhat connects to theory of mind as we understand it. But it is not disembodied like our theory of mind is. So I think, once Dorothy was wheeled away, they're now in this new Dorothy-less world. Whether she exists still in their memory or not, we don't know. We don't know how they access their memories, but we know that that this had profound effects. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about this before I move to the next topic. No, I think we're good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about morality. Now, I've chosen this topic to speak more about just simply because it represents the theme I'm going to come back to at the end, which is modularity. So humans have cognitive abilities, animals have cognitive abilities. What makes us unique potentially is our ability to combine them, right? To combine different modes of cognition into that inner experience that we call our mind, right? And what we do know is that we have a couple of areas of our brain are quite a bit larger than the creatures that came before us. And those are association areas. They promote modularity. The cerebrum, the frontal lobe, gets particularly the prefrontal cortex, the very front part of the brain, gets all the attention because we know that executive function, planning, mental time travel, that all takes place up here. That gets a lot of attention, and appropriately so. But did you know there's an area of the brain that expanded more than the frontal lobe, and that is the cerebellum in the back? Right? The cerebellum is an integration area of lots of different inputs. And so the idea that, and this happened early in human evolution, before the expansion, or I shouldn't say before, but coincident, but it reached its full size before, for example, the split with Neanderthals. So Neanderthals had huge cerebellums the way that we do. Cerebella, I guess would be the better way to say that. So that association is to put different concepts together into a unified experience. And that unified experience, I believe, is the mind, is that subjective inner thing that we have, that we can't really access in other people or creatures. Okay, so I think morality is a good example of that modularity, of the idea of putting different concepts together into a sense, because we all have, almost all of us, a moral sense of that this is right, this is wrong, we ought to do this, we ought not do that. We have to speak up when we see violations of these codes and so on and so forth. But you can break down morality into individual components, and let's talk about that. So for example, one big component of morality is fairness, just the basic principle of fairness. Equal treatment, where everybody gets an equal shake, and then also rules or codes that we all have to follow that are associated with punishments when you don't and rewards when you do. So we know, for example, that animals have codes of behavior and they're punished when they don't follow. And that's what I mean about chimpanzees having to grow up around chimpanzees. And the same thing is true of the ancestor of dogs, which is wolves. Wolves have very complicated rules associated with play behaviors and hunting behaviors. And if you bite too hard when you're playing, you get shunned, right? They do timeouts for usually children, juveniles. And so they have these codes. And the idea that you could recognize equal treatment was originally controversial, that other animals would do this, but I'll show you some experiments that really broke through. Morality is more than that, though, right? It's not just equal treatment. There's something more, right? And that's that sense of altruism, which is the idea that you would do good for someone with no immediate benefit for yourself. And that you would, for example, speak up against injustice. And you would be moved by empathy, which leads to compassion. So we'll come back to those. Let's begin with the equal treatment. I'm going to show you an experiment that probably some of you have seen, maybe not all of you, but this is an experiment done. It's a classic experiment, but it was only done about 15 years ago. So it's become a classic very, very fast. And it was in the laboratory of Frans de Waal, by the way. And his postdoc named Sarah Brosnan is going to appear on the screen in a minute. And she performed an experiment with these capuchin monkeys. And what you see, by the way, is the testing facility. This is not how they live. They live, in a large enclosure with lots of others, and this is the cage that they do the testing in. And you'll notice the austere way that the scientist is dressed and presents. She's going to be very robotic because you try everything you can to not influence their behavior, because animals respond. In fact, they've even seen that mice often behave differently in some intelligence tests based on if it's a man or a woman performing the test. They're much more agitated by males than they are by females. And they've been able to reproduce this by just taking smelly shirts from men. So it's an olfactory signal. Anyway, you have to be very careful not to influence your animals. So that's why she's dressed the way she is. She also, of course, doesn't want to make them sick. So what's going to happen here is she has trained these two capuchin monkeys to perform a very simple task, to return a token. She puts a token in and they have to return it. That's it. When they perform this task, they're going to get a reward. The reward for that task could be a cucumber, or it could be a grape. They're perfectly happy to perform this either way. They'll do the reward, or they'll do the task for the reward, cucumber or grape, but they prefer a grape, right? Primates are driven to sweet foods as a way of driving them towards ripening fruit. We can talk about that if somebody wants, but sweet things, primates like sweet stuff. By the way, we evolved that to send us to fruit, but this is what we eat instead. It's a human error. Anyway, so watch what happens though. So she's going to do the task of these monkeys, but she's going to treat them differently, and watch how quickly they recognize this. So this capuchin monkey is going to do the task. Here comes the token. I always put a little delay there. Okay, got to return it. And here's your reward, cucumber. Great, he eats it, perfectly happy to eat it. This monkey is now performing the task, returning the token. Here comes the reward. What's he going to get? Uh-oh, a grape. Uh-oh, this one recognizes it. Ooh, I'm going to get a grape too. Nope, you're going to get a cucumber for the same task. He didn't like that. So here's the other one again, performing the task. And he's going to get a grape. This capuchin monkey says, was there something wrong with this token? Did I get a bad one? Return it. Here comes the cucumber. So this descends into a tantrum. I don't know how long this went on, but the idea is that all social animals can recognize fair and unfair conditions, and they will refuse to play along. Now, again, think about this for a while. So you have to recognize the injustice of it all, the unfairness, but you also then have to act on it. Now, that seems like a pretty self-defeating behavior, because the person that you're throwing the tantrum at is the only person who could give you the grape in this moment. It's a resource, and you're getting rid of a food in order to protest not getting the one you want. It's kind of obnoxious and self-defeating. And I think that's the resemblance to humans that we're all seeing there, is that obnoxiousness. However, what I would argue is, no, this monkey is acting in his own self-interest, because that's what standing up for injustice is to work towards a better future where you have the equal treatment or the other reward. Now, that doesn't mean that he contemplates that with all the words I just used, but the idea that there's an instinct to stand up for injustice. Now, one thing, this could also be described by a different emotion called jealousy, right? So it could be jealousy or envy. And a lot of scientists were, when this experiment first came out, criticized it. And there were even some philosophers and others who said, well, listen, really, that's not really intolerance to inequity. It would only really classify that as if they stood up for someone else not getting a good reward, right? And I bet they wish they hadn't put that in writing, because those experiments have now been done. Now, this is a higher level task. You won't find it in capuchin monkeys, but in chimpanzees, you will. A chimpanzee being treated differently than another chimpanzee will, not every time, but will often refuse to participate after a while. Maybe not the first, maybe not the second, but after a while, they will refuse to participate even when they are the beneficiary of the unequal treatment. However, that effect, you can dial it up and down based on how closely they're affiliated, right? And are we any different? We care a lot more about the suffering we can see and hear than some place that takes place far away in a planet, or on a continent, and people that don't look like us. We identify with those that we identify with, if you'll pardon the tautology there. But it's true that when we have close affiliation, we're much more moved, and that's true in animals as well. So that's the intolerance to iniquity, and that leads to rules, laws, punishments, and rewards that play out during behavior. And I mentioned the wolves policing each other's behavior. That kind of behavior is found in basically all social animals. One thing that's important to note here is the sociality is key. You'll notice I'll often say social mammals, social mammals, social mammals. A lot of this stuff you don't see in solitary mammals. There aren't that many solitary mammals, because our life begins in that social environment of nursing. So you're automatically social right from birth. But there are some creatures that then become solitary as they grow up. Tasmanian devils, orangutans, for a primate example, are largely solitary as adults. And because of that, you don't see a lot of this stuff. So the social environment and that social evolution is important. So what about altruism? Well, altruism is interesting because we tend to think of it as doing good for someone else that can never repay you. Helping a homeless person, they're never going to be able to pay you back. So it's not just pro-social, it's altruistic. Okay. However, that is viewing the event as a one-time transaction, as if it doesn't take place within your whole life history. Because what I would argue that altruism always does have some component of reciprocity, in the sense that we're all on this planet together, but we evolved in groups of 150 or so. So the idea that you would be kind to someone that you would never see again, that wasn't the case. Everyone you saw, you were either directly related to or you would see again. So the instinct to help someone that needs help has reciprocity built into it. And that, I don't think less of altruism in that context. It just adds an explanation. And this was first discovered in a species, the lowly bat. Is anybody going to know this experiment with the bats? Okay, so bats, specifically vampire bats in Costa Rica, this experiment was done, or I should say this is just an observational experiment, but they would notice that when bats go out and fly, flying is the most metabolically demanding thing you can do. So when bats fly, they consume an enormous amount of calories. If they don't find food that night, which is usually, these are vampire bats, so they're sucking on livestock usually, sucking blood from livestock. If you don't eat that night, you can survive, but you can't survive a second night. You will starve to death if you go 2 nights without eating, if you are a bat. So what happens after a night of not feeding? when they come back, scientists noticed that the bats will sometimes share with each other. And how do you share if you're a bat? You regurgitate food into the mouth of another one. All right, so it's kind of gross. Vampire bats are one of the most disgusting animals, and they're vomiting blood in each other's mouth. But it's also kind of beautiful if you think about it, because you have an animal helping a hungry friend. And I'll show you a video of it. Trust me, it's not that gross. You can barely see what's going on, but you see enough to know what's happening here. So watch these bats coming back. There's no color, of course, because this is pitch black. And here comes a hungry bat. You notice the donor isn't shy, walks right over. And there they are, sharing food. This is not mother and child. These are not siblings necessarily. This is a fed bat helping a hungry bat. Because after a night of not eating, they're on the brink of starvation. And here they are sharing food. This is a great example of you only seek what you find. This behavior was only found in the late 90s. And even though bats have been part of our common understanding for a long, long time. And here they are sharing food with each other. Now, you might ask, okay, well, this is just, social behavior, group cohesion. Yeah, that's the point. That's how altruism works. It keeps us tied together. It keeps our fates tied together. And to show that this is reciprocal, the bat that has the food in his belly, and by the way, they regurgitate about 1/3 of the meal, which means that they're now considerably less fed. And they know this because they can weigh the bats before and after, because they eat about 40% of their body weight at once. And 1/3 of their meal goes to the partner to make sure they can make it to the next night. However, not every interaction results in successful food sharing. Sometimes there are refusals. And what happens is the bats are way more likely to share to a bat that has shared with others. Not just themselves, though, right? So they can recognize, who's been naughty and who's been nice, not even just to themselves. And if you think about that, that's part of the purpose of altruism is, look, man, we help each other. That's what you do. And if you don't do it, you're at peril. And when you're in groups of 150 or less, like our ancestors were, that's a pretty good system for keeping the group together and performing at its best. Now, those of you with an evolutionary biology program running in your brain might say, you're sounding like group selection, which evolutionary biologists don't believe in group selection. It's only individual and gene selection. I am very happy to report that the thinking in evolutionary biology is getting much more open-minded about group selection. And what I mean by group selection is usually if something's good for the group but not for yourself, there's no way to evolve that because you're constantly at a detriment, so your genes wouldn't enjoy the success and be spread. However, the work of David Sloan Wilson and others have shown, both mathematically and with field observations, that yes, within a group, competition usually wins, but cooperative groups beat non-cooperative groups every time. And so if you imagine not just human evolution, but our ancestors and apes before that as groups competing with one another, the groups that share with each other and do well and take care of each other will overtake those that don't. So that pro-social attitude and instinct, emotion, if you will, would be selected for. So the answer of altruism, what's in it for me? Everything. If you want to live in a world where we take care of each other, you participate in it. And there might be a punishment if you don't. So it can be reduced, I hate that word, to something like reciprocity. And I'm going to now move, I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to move pretty quick through to this next concept, which is empathy, the biology of empathy. So I don't know if you guys have heard of mirror neurons. These are neurons that are activated in the brain when we witness behaviors or emotions in others that kind of call up that same experience in our own brain. So the classic example is you take a pitcher of water and you like pour it into a cup. Certain neurons fire in your brain associated with that, but they also fire, driven by the mirror neurons, when you see someone else do it, right? So you have that understanding of how that works, and it gets called up. And then you can even pantomime it and trick people's minds into running those programs. That was all discovered in monkeys, by the way. So monkeys have these mirror neurons, rhesus macaques specifically, and the idea that you can recognize other behavior and call up the same kind of neuronal activity by simply observing it. So that's perspective taking, and I also mentioned emotional contagion before. And once again, what's in it for me? So that's the cold Darwinian view on everything, is it has to be good for you if it's going to be selected for. Well, again, if you're within a group, an empathic and compassionate group takes care of its members, first of all, and social cohesion, but then also works better together, right? So especially when you talk about cognitive empathy, your ability to work with someone is directly related to how well you understand them, how well you understand what motivates them, what will get them on your side. However, the exact same skill set works when you're competing against them. By understanding what motivates them, how they think, what they feel, you can better compete against them. So whether it's cooperation or competition, in a sense, doesn't matter. They both promote the idea that understanding another person's point of view gives you an advantage, either with them or against them, but either way, you're better off. So empathy and compassion, there's a good evolutionary reasoning there. So this brings me to my component of modularity, why I think this is going to be the key to human uniqueness, is the idea that many of these individual programs we're going to find in other animals if we haven't yet, and they're going to be fairly well developed. But what we do have is two huge areas of our brain that have expanded a lot during the course of human evolution, and those are association areas. There's no brand new abilities, but the ability to integrate lots of inputs into that sort of inner experience of calculation or integration, however you want to think about it, into whatever you do next, for example, your decision making or how you live your life. That modularity, I think, is going to be the key to why we have been able to be as successful as we have. But when it comes to success, one thing I want to point out, to critique Fuzz a little bit, since he was picking on me, actually he's quoting someone else when he talks about, if you look at how chimpanzees and how they've just kind of stayed in their rainforest and they're on the brink of extinction, and look at us, we're all around the planet. Well, keep in mind how recent that success is, and think about all of the species that came before us that didn't make it. So chimpanzees were more resilient than everything else that came before us, right, in our lineage, right? So Homo erectus was the most successful hominin the world ever saw until we emerged. Where are they now? They're gone. They have some offshoots that evolved into other things, but they're gone. And they were on 4 continents, probably, 3 for sure, and lots of islands. Very successful, the smartest thing the planet had ever seen, and they're gone, right? Everything that came before us in that lineage is gone. So we can't use success as a measure of like intelligence or even cognition, right? Because cognition and cognitive abilities, it's not all upside, right? There are negative consequences to cognition. And if you look at some of the things we're doing right now to ourselves and the planet, it's not real hard to imagine how cognition has gotten us into a lot of trouble. And you can map that onto other species and environments. For example, if you get so good at using trees as a resource, for example, on Rapa Nui, right, the Easter Island, you get so good at using trees as a resource, you cut them all down, you're in trouble after that, right? So intelligence and cognition, even goal-oriented behavior, isn't always good, because evolution doesn't really reward long-term thinking, right? It can reward a generation or two in the future, and that's it. We are not trained by evolution to think very far ahead. Hopefully, that's what makes us unique, is we'll start one day to think very far ahead. So that's all I have for you, and I look forward to the panel.